There's a particular moment I've seen play out more times than I can count. A child freezes. Maybe it's thunder, maybe it's a nightmare, maybe it's just the dark hallway that suddenly looks like a trap instead of a passage. And before the child even finishes forming what they feel, an adult steps in with what they think is comfort. Don't be scared. It's nothing. You're fine. Now, I understand the intention. Most adults are not trying to dismiss anything. They are trying to end the discomfort quickly, like plugging a leak before it spreads. But here is the part that most people miss. Fear in a child does not respond to logic. It responds to recognition. When a child hears, "don't be scared," their nervous system doesn't relax. It does the opposite. It registers something far more subtle, but far more powerful. What I feel is not acceptable here. And that's where the real problem begins. From a psychological standpoint, fear is one of the earliest survival systems in the brain. It sits deep in the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which is responsible for detecting threat. In children, this system is active and sensitive, but the part that evaluates and rationalizes, what we call the prefrontal cortex, is still under construction. That means a child is not overreacting. They are reacting with an incomplete toolkit. So when an adult tries to override fear with logic, they are essentially speaking to a part of the brain that is not in charge in that moment. It's like trying to calm a fire alarm by explaining why smoke is not dangerous. The system isn't listening to explanations, it is responding to perceived threat. And here's where it gets even more interesting. When fear is dismissed repeatedly, children don't necessarily become braver, they become quieter about fear. That is not the same thing. One is emotional regulation, the other is emotional suppression, and those two paths lead to very different adolescent outcomes. I've watched children learn very quickly which emotions are welcome and which ones are inconvenient for adults. And fear, especially irrational, messy, inconvenient fear, often gets filed under the second category. So they adapt, not by overcoming fear, but by hiding it. What looks like confidence later in life is sometimes just well practiced concealment. So, before we even get into what to say, there's a more uncomfortable truth we need to sit with. Most adults don't fail because they lack love. They fail because they mistake silencing fear for supporting a child through it. And that distinction is where everything changes. If you've spent enough time around children, you start to notice something slightly puzzling. Fear doesn't always show up where adults expect it to. A child might panic over a shadow on the wall, but stay completely calm about something objectively more serious. Or a teenager might look indifferent on the surface while quietly spiraling over something that seems small to everyone else. That mismatch is not confusion, it's development. A child's brain is still learning how to measure threat accurately. The emotional system often develops faster than the cognitive system that evaluates risk. So, what you get is a very active alarm system with a still calibrating judge. The result? Everything can feel urgent when it is emotionally charged. For younger children, fear is often concrete and imaginative. Darkness is not low light, it is something inhabited. A closed door is not just a door, it is a boundary that something might cross. Their brains are not being irrational. They are using imagination as a survival tool because they don't yet have enough real world data to override it. Now move into adolescence, and the shape of fear changes, but it doesn't disappear. It becomes more social, more internal. Instead of monsters under the bed, it becomes, what if I'm not good enough? What if I embarrass myself? What if they're all laughing at me and I just don't know it yet? This is where many adults misread things badly. A teenager's fear rarely looks like trembling or tears. It often looks like withdrawal, irritation, sarcasm, or silence. On the surface, it can even look like arrogance. Underneath, it is usually uncertainty trying to protect itself. Psychologically, this shift is tied to the development of identity processing and social evaluation systems in the brain. Adolescents become highly sensitive to peer perception because evolutionarily, belonging becomes tied to survival at that stage. So, fear becomes less about physical danger and more about social risk. And here's the key point that changes everything: fear is often symbolic. A child afraid of sleeping alone may not be afraid of darkness itself. They may be afraid of separation, unpredictability, or lack of control. A teenager anxious about school may not just be afraid of grades, they may be afraid of what those grades mean about who they are becoming. When adults respond only to the surface fear, they miss the real emotional language underneath it. That is why telling a child there's nothing to be afraid of often fails, because from their perspective, there is something to be afraid of, even if it is not what the adult assumes. And once you understand that fear is not always literal, you start to see why the first response matters far more than the explanation that comes later. There's a very small window when a child is afraid that determines everything that comes after it. Not 5 minutes later, not after the explanation. The first 30 seconds. That is when the nervous system is deciding one critical thing: am I safe here with what I'm feeling, or am I alone with it? And this is where most adults accidentally lose the moment, not because they don't care, but because they rush straight into fixing instead of connecting. What actually helps in that first moment is not information, it is co regulation. That simply means your calm system temporarily becomes the anchor for their overwhelmed one. Children don't borrow logic first, they borrow emotional safety. So instead of "there's nothing to be afraid of," the goal is to meet the emotion where it is without arguing with it. Simple phrases carry far more weight than people realize. "I see you're scared right now. That felt really big for you. I'm here with you." Notice what these do. They don't erase the fear, they name it. And naming an emotion is not just language, it's neurological regulation. When a feeling is identified accurately, the brain begins to organize it instead of spiraling inside it. But words alone are not the main tool here. Tone is, presence is, even silence is. A child in fear is not listening for a lecture. They are scanning for signals. Is this adult calm? Are they rushed? Are they irritated? Are they present or already halfway out of the moment? If your body is tense while your words are soft, the child believes the body, not the words. So sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pause before you speak. Sit closer, lower your voice, slow everything down. Let your nervous system set the tempo first, because children don't just hear reassurance, they absorb it. There is also something subtle but very important here. You are not trying to convince the child that there is no danger. You are helping them realize they are not alone in the feeling of danger. That distinction is what creates trust. Once a child feels that their fear is allowed to exist in the room without punishment or dismissal, something shifts internally. The intensity doesn't always disappear immediately, but it stops escalating. And that is the first real step toward emotional regulation. In many ways, those first 30 seconds are not about solving anything. They are about communicating one message clearly, even without saying it directly. You are safe to feel this here, and I am not going anywhere just because you are afraid. And once that is established, everything that follows becomes easier to guide. This is the part most adults don't like hearing, because the phrases we're about to talk about are usually said with good intentions. In fact, they often sound like comfort. But in a child's emotional world, intent doesn't matter as much as impact. Let's start with the most common one: be brave. On the surface, it sounds encouraging. But to a child who is already overwhelmed, be brave can translate internally as stop feeling what you're feeling right now. It quietly turns fear into a performance requirement. And when children can't meet that requirement, they don't become braver, they become more ashamed of being afraid. Then there's nothing to be afraid of. This one is especially tricky because, from the adult's perspective, it's factually correct. But fear is not a debate about facts, it is a lived experience. When a child hears this, what they often register is, "What I feel is incorrect." And once a child starts believing their emotions are wrong, they stop trusting them. That doesn't reduce anxiety, it often relocates it inward. Another one is, "Stop acting like that," or "You're too old for this." These phrases introduce shame directly into the emotional moment. And shame has a very specific effect in psychology. It doesn't regulate emotion, it suppresses expression. So the child doesn't stop feeling fear, they stop showing fear. And what is unexpressed rarely disappears, it accumulates. There is also a quieter, more subtle one, rushing into reassurance too quickly. "It's fine, it's fine, it's fine." Repeated reassurance without emotional acknowledgement can unintentionally signal impatience. The child begins to feel like their emotional state is something to be rushed through rather than understood. Now, here's the pattern underneath all of this. Every one of these responses has one thing in common: it skips the emotional reality and goes straight to correction. But fear doesn't respond well to correction, it responds to containment. When a child's fear is consistently dismissed or minimized, even gently, they begin to learn a powerful internal lesson: "I am on my own with my big feelings." And that is where long term emotional patterns begin to form. Some children shut down and internalize everything. Others escalate emotionally because escalation becomes the only way to feel seen. Neither outcome is about the original fear anymore. It becomes about how safe it felt to express it in the first place. So the goal is not to become overly cautious with every word. The goal is to stop treating fear like a problem to correct and start treating it like a state to understand. Because once shame enters the equation, the conversation is no longer about fear, it becomes about hiding fear. Once you remove the harmful responses, the real work begins, replacing them with something that actually helps a child's nervous system settle instead of tighten. The simplest and most effective structure is this: three steps that sound almost too basic, but psychologically, they are doing a lot of heavy lifting. First, acknowledge what is happening in front of you. "I can see you're scared right now." That statement does something important. It removes confusion. The child is no longer wondering if their reaction is being noticed or judged. It is simply being observed with calm attention. Second, normalize the feeling without minimizing it. A lot of people feel this way sometimes. This is where perspective enters, not to dismiss the fear, but to reduce the isolation around it. Fear becomes something human, not something abnormal. And when fear feels less special or shameful, its intensity often decreases. Third, return a sense of control in a small, concrete way. What would help you feel a bit safer right now? This is crucial. Fear strips a child of perceived control. Even small choices, sitting closer, turning on a light, holding a hand, breathing together, help the brain reestablish agency. And agency is one of the fastest ways to reduce emotional overwhelm. Now, here's what makes this approach powerful over time. You are not teaching the child to avoid fear. You are teaching them to move through it without collapsing or hiding. Children who are consistently met with this kind of response begin to develop something subtle but life changing: emotional vocabulary. They start to say things like, "I feel nervous," instead of acting out, or "This is making me uncomfortable," instead of shutting down completely. That shift is not automatic. It is learned through repeated experience of being understood. And as children grow into adolescence, this foundation becomes even more important. Because teenage fear is rarely loud, it is layered. It hides under silence, sarcasm, overthinking, or sudden emotional distance. A teenager who learned early that emotions are safe to express is far more likely to come forward when things feel overwhelming, instead of internalizing everything until it becomes anxiety or avoidance. There is also a deeper long term effect here that many adults only recognize later. Emotional safety builds emotional resilience. Not toughness in the superficial sense, but the ability to feel something intense and still remain psychologically anchored. And that comes from repetition, not perfect parenting moments, but consistent ones. A child does not need an adult who eliminates all fear. That is impossible anyway. What they need is an adult who stays steady when fear shows up, instead of disappearing emotionally or reacting with frustration. Over time, that steadiness becomes internalized. The child begins to borrow your regulation until they develop their own. And eventually, what they carry into adulthood is not the absence of fear, but the confidence that fear is not something they have to face alone or suppress. If there's one thing I've learned from watching children grow through fear, it is this: they don't remember every explanation you gave them. They don't even remember most of the words you used. What they remember is the feeling of that moment. Did someone rush them? Did someone dismiss them? Or did someone stay close enough, calm enough, to make the fear feel less like something dangerous and more like something survivable? Fear in a child is never just about the dark room, the loud thunder, or the imagined monster. It is about whether their internal world feels understood or invalidated when it becomes uncomfortable. And this is where everything we've talked about comes together. The first instinct to correct fear, the misunderstanding of how it shows up, the importance of those first 30 seconds, and the quiet damage of dismissive phrases, they all point to one simple truth. Emotional safety is not built through advice, it is built through presence. When a child learns that their fear can exist without being punished, minimized, or rushed away, something very important develops over time. They don't just become less fearful, they become more emotionally stable in how they relate to fear itself. It stops being something to hide or fight alone. And that carries forward into adolescence and adulthood in ways most people don't fully appreciate until much later. So, if you take anything from this, let it be this: you are not trying to eliminate fear from your child's life. That is not the goal. You are trying to become the kind of steady presence that makes fear feel manageable instead of overwhelming. Now, I genuinely like to hear from you. What's a moment where a child's fear caught you off guard? And what did you say in that moment? Share it in the comments. I do go through them and I respond when I can. If this helped reframe how you think about fear in children, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more parents and caregivers see what children actually need in those difficult moments, and it keeps these conversations going.